You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for March 22nd, 2019. Today we have an ACC and European Heart Rhythm recap. The ACC meeting in New Orleans was special. It was really exciting to be there. There's no way I'll be able to cover all of the stories in one podcast, so this week and next week will include ACC studies. Now, the European Heart Rhythm Association meeting was also ongoing at Lisbon, Portugal at nearly the same time, and why EHRA leaders chose to do this perplexes me. But there are also a couple of studies from there that were worth covering in the next two podcasts. But before I start, I want to say how moving it was that many of you came up to me at ACC and said that you listened to the show. These are really kind gestures, and gosh, it meant a lot to me, so thank you. Now, the first topic today is the Apple Heart study. I've struggled with what to say about this. Now, perhaps that's because Apple Heart breaks the normal mold. Normally, on the big stage of scientific meetings, we're used to hearing studies that test whether or not a treatment is a breakthrough. To do that, the treatment has already gone through some sort of testing, say phase 1 or phase 2 trials. Then there's also an experiment, drug A versus drug B, or device versus drug. Apple Heart has none of that. It describes the use of a plaything for the rich. Apple convinced the FDA that its watch was not a medical device, but Apple's multiple media stories on how the watch saved someone's life belies that claim. And surely that the Apple Heart study and its presentation at a leading medical meeting, that seems to treat the device as a medical device rather than a plaything. Remember, Apple Heart had no comparison group, yet the ACC organizers let the company essentially dominate the first day of ACC. Now, at this moment, I'm going to refrain from getting into the nitty-gritty of the statistics on Apple Heart. I'm going to wait for the paper and do a proper analysis then. But a couple of general points to highlight. It is true that the Apple Heart study showed that virtual enrollment can enroll millions of people quickly. That's new, and that's kind of big. But Dr. Steve Nissen from the Cleveland Clinic said it well. He said the data are still, quote, unpublished, unverified, unreviewed, and not tested by peers. He said the unknowns could be expensive. I endorse this statement 100%. And Dr. Rajat Dio from the University of Pennsylvania said he was not blaming Apple for giving us too much information. But this statement breaks many of the basic rules of clinical medicine. Namely, you don't order tests just to gather information. And to any learners out there, usually I order tests only if you have a question in mind and you have a plan for the results. Now, the Apple Heart co-primary investigator Marco Perez said from the podium in the Q&A that Apple Heart study gives clinicians information they can use. Now, respectfully, nothing could be further from the truth. Apple Heart study gives clinicians no reliable information about what to do. In fact, it has made our job harder. What, for instance, am I supposed to do even if the watch finds a true positive AFib episode of 20 minutes in a 64-year-old female? Who is helped by this knowledge? Finally, I want to make a comment on a conflict of interest. Well, pharma and medical device companies make money by making products that improve health, and before they can market their therapies, they have to prove benefit and safety. And this model works well for society, albeit imperfectly, because both parties win. Society gets innovative therapies and company makes ample reward. And Apple has similar interest. It is in the business to make money, which is normal and fine. But they can't have it both ways. If they want the watch to be a toy, fine, sell it as one. But if they want to promote it as a medical device, it needs to pass proper muster. Remember, medical interventions come with harms and benefits. If this device leads to low-risk people getting anticoagulation, bleeding may be greater than stroke rate reduction, and that's harm. If the device leads to more patients getting antiarrhythmic drugs or ablation, that too could lead to harm. What Apple should do, and what we as medical people should demand, say also professional societies and patient advocacy groups should all demand a proper RCT, not observational trials designed to garner media headlines. Now, There was an announcement at ACC that Apple and J&J, Johnson & Johnson, will co-sponsor a pragmatic trial called Heartline. And apparently Heartline will investigate whether a new heart health app from J&J, in combination with the Apple Watch, might be able to accelerate the diagnosis of AFib and improve outcomes. We'll have to see the details of the study to determine if it's marketing disguised as science or true science. My friend Venk Murthy from Michigan summed it up well. He said in a tweet, "For the price of a Super Bowl ad, Apple has all the medical world and media covering them for days." Now, the big story. TAVR trials in low-risk patients with aortic stenosis. I think these two trials presented at ACC will usher in a new era of cardiology, and this new era involves replacing a stenotic aortic valve via a catheter rather than surgery. The TAVR innovators first showed it could be done in non-surgical or high-risk patients, and when that worked, they moved to intermediate-risk patients, and when that worked, the next step was low-risk patients. The PARTNER 3 trial, this was a balloon expandable valve versus SAVR in patients at low surgical risk, about 900 patients. Get this, the primary endpoint of death, stroke, or rehospitalization occurred in 8.5% in the TAVR arm and 15.1% in the surgical arm. TAVR benefit was largely driven by rehospitalizations. Specifically, TAVR was associated with 5 fewer deaths, 8 fewer strokes, and 13 fewer rehospitalizations at 1 year. Now you see the caveat. This was the investigators chose to add the softer endpoint of rehospitalization to the composite. All other TAVR trials have used either death or stroke plus death in the composite. This is a bit of a blemish, but it doesn't diminish the remarkably positive findings for TAVR versus SAVR. The Evolute trial is a 2-year trial, but at ACC, the Evolute authors reported 1-year results with, quote, imputed results at 2 years. I know, this too is a big caveat, as 24-month follow-up was available only for 72 patients in the TAVR group and 65 patients in the surgery group, and this is really a small fraction of the total trial population. The Evolute trial was a TAVR versus SAVR RCT using the Medtronic self-expanding TAVR valve. The primary endpoint of death or disabling stroke occurred in 5.3% of the TAVR arm and 6.7% in the surgery group, and this difference easily met non-inferiority criteria but did not reach superiority. Evolute did not include rehospitalizations in the primary endpoint. Good on the researchers there. But a much higher rate of pacemaker implantation in the TAVR arm, 17.4% versus 6%, is a serious issue when the device is used in younger patients who have longer periods of time to experience lead complications and a need for multiple generator replacements. But despite the caveats of these trials, what we can say is that this is impressive data, and I think it's good news for patients. Of course, valve longevity is a major concern, but the notion, which I had held, that surgical bioprosthetic valves last a long time is really not backed up by very rigorous evidence. When I interviewed Dr. Raj Makkar from Cedars-Sinai, he said one of the benefits of this new development in TAVR is that now there will be much more formal data on longevity forthcoming. And as I said in my column on this, much work remains. We need to collect this longevity data. We probably need to restrict TAVR to expert centers, and surely we must be mindful of indication creep. And what I mean by that is we need to restrict aortic valve interventions to patients with symptomatic aortic stenosis. And of course, finally, we need to have good decision tools to aid in shared decision-making with patients. Our hospital's already talking about adding another hybrid room. Now, what about TAVR for bicuspid aortic valve stenosis? The number of patients in the low-risk TAVR trials that I just mentioned that had bicuspid aortic valve stenosis was 0. But TAVR in patients with bicuspid disease is being done, and the STS registry records data on these patients. In a late-breaking session, Dr. Raj Makkar from Cedars-Sinai, he presented real-world data on nearly 82,000 SAPIEN 3 TAVR procedures that were culled from the registry between years 2015 and 2018. Now, they used propensity matching. This was non-randomized comparison of 25 covariates. And what this study was is basically TAVR done in patients with tricuspid aortic valve disease compared with TAVR done in bicuspid aortic valve disease. All-cause mortality was low and similar in both groups. Stroke was 2.4% in TAVR when it was done in bicuspid aortic valve disease and 1.6% when TAVR was done in three-leaflet aortic valve stenosis. But by 1 year, stroke rates were similar in both groups. Now, I discuss this yet-to-be-published abstract because it raises the question as to whether we need an RCT to extend TAVR to bicuspid disease. Now, on the side of we don't need an RCT, you have the impressive data in the TAVR RCTs, and you have this real-world data which suggests that the results are similar. But here, I laud Dr. Makar, who said that for older patients who are intermediate or high risk with bicuspid disease, it's reasonable to consider them based on the CT anatomy for the TAVR procedure. But, he said, for young patients, we must do a randomized clinical trial to definitively establish the safety and efficacy of TAVR in these patients with bicuspid disease. My colleague Patrice Wendling from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology has a terrific story, and she delves into this debate. And central to the issue is that the majority of bicuspid patients would be good candidates for TAVR, but not all of them, as some have specific anatomic issues that would be better approached with surgery. Now, New England Journal of Medicine editor Dr. John Jarko noted in the discussion that it might be hard to enroll patients in such an RCT because doctors may not be willing to randomize their patients. Here, I have a solution. I think this problem could be solved by regulators who tie reimbursement with evidence generation. And I think we need more of this. For instance, yes, we will pay for this procedure, but you have to put your patients into a proper RCT. Then we would have evidence. Third topic today is cardiac device infection. Now, PACER and ICD infections are really bad events, and local antibiotic delivery into the pocket is a plausible potential solution, but there's weak data to support it. The Medtronic Tyrex envelope may work to prevent these infections, and the best way, of course, to test whether interventions work is with an RCT, and that's exactly what happened here in the RAPID trial. Cleveland Clinic researchers led by Dr. Khaldoun Tarakji randomized nearly 7,000 patients, and they found that the device prevented 17 infections. Now, RAPID was a classic case of large relative risk reductions of 40% that translated to a 0.5% risk reduction. Importantly, the device arm did not have more adverse events like hematoma, for instance. I think this is a great study. The problem is that infection rates are low, and it's hard to make a low number lower. So here, the p-value was 0.04. The fragility index, or the number indicating how many patients would be required to convert a trial from being statistically significant to not significant, was 1. But the big problem, bigger than the fragility of the numbers, is cost. If you use the point estimate of the risk reduction of 0.5%, the NNT is 200. The current cost of the envelope is about $1,000. So at that rate, it's about $200,000 per infection saved, which is very expensive. Now, if the envelope was not costly, this therapy would be an easy decision. We would use it a lot. But at this cost, doctors and hospitals have a tough decision to make. Next topic is the issue of what to do when someone presents with out-of-hospital VF arrest. Right now, my interventional partners come in to urgently perform coronary angiography on all patients who have had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and are clearly not having a STEMI. Now, this is because some of these patients have VF arrest because of severe ischemia, and of course, if this was the cause, the treatment is urgent revascularization. But this is a resource-intensive intervention. It delays resuscitation, and it adds risk, say specifically from the contrast in already compromised patients. That's why Dutch researchers decided to test the strategy of immediate versus delayed coronary angiography. They chose a robust primary endpoint of death at 90 days, and they found that the results were similar, 64.5 versus 67.2%, which was not even close to a significant difference. They did find that it took significantly longer in the immediate angiography group to reach target cooling temperatures, and there were no significant differences between the groups in any of the remaining secondary endpoints. I love this quote from Dr. Quinn Capers from Ohio State. He said, "Sometimes the wisest course of action is to be thoughtful and delay." Of course, translating this trial into practice means choosing patients similar to those in the trial, for instance, patients without obvious acute MI and those who are hemodynamically stable. I also highlight this study because it is a great example of how pragmatic RCTs can be done and how they can shed light not just on drugs or devices, but also strategies of care. Final topic. This is a super important trial in atrial fibrillation. It's from EHRA, European Heart Rhythm, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I've already been sending this PDF around to my group. As a medical conservative, I shun aggressive interventions when there is no evidence to support it. I strongly believe that one of the best treatments for acute atrial fibrillation is time. Time. I call it the Voltaire approach because Voltaire famously said that good doctors distract the patient long enough to let nature heal. I really despise the rapid cardioversion approach to atrial fibrillation in the emergency department. So I was over the moon to read that Dutch researchers, again, the Dutch are killing it, randomized patients to immediate cardioversion in the ED versus delayed cardioversion if atrial fib persisted. The wait-and-see approach involved an initial treatment with rate control meds and then delayed cardioversion if the AFib did not resolve within 48 hours. The primary endpoint they chose was sinus rhythm at 4 weeks. And in this trial of about 400 patients, they found no significant differences, 91 versus 94%. The p-value was 0.005 for non-inferiority. Now here's the best part. Sit down for this. Nearly 70% of the delayed cardioversion group had spontaneously converted by the next day's visit. This is a hugely important study. You don't have to shock people in the emergency department with AFib who are stable. You can take a wait-and-see approach. In acute atrial fibrillation, I say give peace a chance. So that's it for this week in cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. And remember, if you like this podcast, please consider subscribing, writing us a review so other people can find us. I'll be back next week with more studies from ACC and European Heart Rhythm.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.